Good afternoon, everyone. And Jimmy, thank you so much for making the trip to Houston once again to have this conversation with us. We're always so happy to have you with us.
And I'm always happy to be back.
So Simon set this up really nicely, but I thought we could start by just to set up some context for the audience, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Resilient Sounds Project and how it was structured.
Well, the Resilient Sounds Project went across a year and a half to 2 years, I think. And I always like to say that it was as much about the destination as the journey. Because what we had was, at the core, a mentorship program for 6 young composers. And as Simon said, 3 from Rice University and 3 from the University of Houston. But besides that, we actually gave it a human dimension when we paired each of those composers with a refugee from Houston, the Houston area. And for that, we had the help of Interfaith Ministries. To make things more complicated for us, we decided to add creative partners. And the reason for this is I didn't want any work in the program to compete with the other. I wanted each of them to be completely unique. So we had one which was made for a film, another one that had a soprano as a soloist, like the one we're going to hear today had a narrator, and so forth. So each project was unique and special. And of course, that added to the complexity. But for that reason, we created this frame that was very well structured, started with, of course, an initial meeting with everyone, and then a workshop where we were testing the creative partners and a piano reduction to see what the progress of the composers was. By then, they had already met the refugees and had shared their stories. Then we had another workshop with a full orchestra. They had private meetings with me for me to mentor the composers, and we had endless logistical discussions about how to bring this about. All of that culminating in the concert, of course, that really created this sense of community here.
Yeah, and I think that the way you conceived it and the way that we created this project was really beautiful because every piece ended up being so unique, just like all of the stories that the composers were telling. But in terms of giving them experience in writing for the orchestral art form, they were also able to get experience working with other types of creative artists and understanding the additional layer of having to consider what a voice is capable of, what it meant to work with a dancer or a filmmaker. And on top of that, they were all in different levels of their own development and education because we had a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctoral student from each school. So it was diverse in many different ways. And I think that really made it so rewarding to see their growth over the course of the project. And we'll talk a little bit about down the road how those composers have had their own trajectory. So I remember sitting with you almost exactly 6 years ago at the hotel right across from Jones Hall having a discussion with some of our colleagues, and that ended up being the conception of this project. But when you started as our composer in residence, you already had the idea in mind of doing a project working with young composers. So can you tell us a little bit about your inspiration and how the idea for this project came about?
Absolutely. Well, my idea when I came to Houston was to really understand what was important to the city of Houston, and really, that's why we had these strategic meetings, these brainstorming meetings with the whole team. And one of the questions that I asked was, what is it that makes Houstonians most proud? And unlike what I thought, they would probably mention the space program, which we're all familiar with. They are very proud of it too, of course, but diversity came first. Houston being the most diverse urban area, ethnically speaking, in the United States. Not only that, it is also the city in the United States that welcomes the most refugees. So knowing this was actually an eye-opener, and it made me think, well, we need to actually broadcast this. We need to make a whole project about it, and I understand what they are proud about it. And that's when the idea of not only creating 6 new works, which in and of its own was of course very valuable for the composers, to work with musicians of the level of the Houston Symphony, which every young composer doesn't get that chance, but to add this layer of humanity to the project. and to create connections within the fabric of Houston. Because these are people who were coexisting in the same society, probably visiting the same restaurants, but not necessarily talking to each other. And we had all these creative partners, composers, musicians, and refugees who had come from vastly different realities come together and create this project together. So that was actually what ignited the desire to make this what it is now.
And I remember talking to the composers who are part of this program after they met their refugee partners, and they were just blown away by the harrowing and inspiring stories, but also just the hopefulness and the light that they brought in all of their conversations. And I know they felt just so inspired and so moved and privileged to have made those connections. And just to shine a light on the work of Interfaith Ministries resettles legal refugees fleeing their homelands in fear of political, social, or religious persecution, and they provide services to the refugees such as housing, English classes, cultural orientation, job placement, and school enrollment. And over 90% of the refugees that Interfaith Ministries work with become independent and productive members of society after 6 months, which is extraordinary when you consider what it must take to become a part of a new community and learning a new language and learning how to live and starting from nothing in a community. It's really pretty amazing. So several of the composers that we worked with, of the 6, and all of them actually have gone on to embark on exciting professional journeys of their own. So I know you spent a lot of time working with them in workshops and a lot of one-on-one mentorship time with them, which I know is really valuable and really helped bring along a successful 6 performances for us. So are you still in touch with any of the composers that you worked with over the course of this project?
Well, I was in Houston recently for another premiere of mine, the first part of my symphony, Eclipse, and I met one of the composers who attended the concert, Victor, who was here momentarily. He's going to go do a PhD now, and actually I have seen that 2 of our composers, Alejandro went back to Mexico, Erberk went back to Turkey, and they are doing really important work in their own respective countries, interacting with a lot of high-level musicians and continuing to create. And I've seen all our other composers also to continue to flourish and continue advancing their degrees and their knowledge. So it makes me really proud to have actually been in touch with them at some point and have been able to contribute a little bit to their development.
Yeah, and we're sorry that Patrick, who is the composer of the piece that we'll be performing for you today, wasn't able to join us because he's now a composer and arranger in the United States Air Force Band, and so he wasn't able to get leave to join us, but hopefully he'll be able to see us on the live stream. So hi, Patrick. We miss you.
We're very proud of you.
Yeah. So for those in the audience who might be interested in embarking on a project like this at their home orchestras, who feel inspired by this work or by another thing that they've seen in the conference and are wanting to take on an ambitious project, what advice might you have for those people?
Do it. Please do. I mean, it really made my life so much richer. I think everyone here in Houston, there was not a single dry eye at the end of the concert, because that audience was comprised of people who were deeply connected to the material. We tend to think, or at least modern audiences used to, especially, not less so now, to think that classical contemporary music was somewhat far removed from our reality. But we, through this project, have proved that there's nothing more far from it. Because in fact, by creating new works that were retelling the stories of these refugees who belong to their community, I mean, here were their brothers, their sisters, their mothers, their children, looking at a work that was celebrating their struggles and celebrating their triumph and the way that they overcame all these difficulties. And so seeing that on stage, framed by a completely new work, was really moving, was really inspiring. So that's when we can harness the power of contemporary music to create works that are relevant to us today. You know, for example, when I was working here and I worked on my second symphony, I kept saying, well, Beethoven, with all his genius, couldn't have written a piece about the space program, because it was just not his time. we are here in our time. Let's celebrate our time. Let's create works that celebrate our stories, the current stories, and that's how contemporary music can have a very close and important impact in the everyday life of your audiences. So I think if you actually have that focus, if you come to a community like I did, I do not live in Houston, but I feel like I'm part of the family now through this project because I really immersed myself understanding what was important to this community. And I think us artists who usually visit other places, we might be a little slightly disconnected with the places that we go. So it's important to really foster and try to encourage those connections.
Well, Jimmy, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today, and you're such an important part of the Houston Symphony family, and we're so glad that we were able to share some of this with all of the conference attendees. So if all of you will join me in welcoming the musicians of the Houston Symphony after the orchestra tunes, they will perform What It Takes to Thrive with music by Patrick W. Lentz, words by Logan Butcher, and narration by Muhammad Khairisman, conducted by our assistant conductor, Gonzalo Farias. Thank you so much.
Thank you.